What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the top decks to climb in Marvel Snap. It's very hard to start anywhere, but with this list, it is an absolute banger of a deck using the same package that dominated the previous metagame of Angela, Ravonna, and Thena, replacing your endgame of Professor X with an endgame of giant women, Sasquatch, Sage, and of course, Mockingbird. Now, you also have an Iron Man playing a supportive role for those who are fans of gender equality. And this deck is effectively saying, I don't really need any tech, I just need a bunch of points. It plays a lot like the old school bounce decks, and I would consider it the sort of baseline for this metagame. It is by far the most common deck that I see. I played so many mirrors of this deck. It is very, very common at the top end of Infinite. There is one piece of tech that you'll be asking questions about. That is, of course, Morph. I have grown more and more sure of Morph to the point that several of my friends have been cutting Jeff to fit Juggernaut into this deck, as opposed to cutting Morph, who is just an absolute all-star, phenomenal in mirrors, and that is quite important right now, and generally just great at doing what this deck wants to do, which is have a lot of points and discount a Mockingbird. Morph is a legitimate, genuine kind of mirror breaker card, where the Morph is the card that will, like, you'll get your opponent's Iron Man, and that's just, like, totally unbeatable in a matchup where everything is about stats. And so the flex spot ends up being Jeff instead for those trying to fit Juggernaut in. I'll be honest, I had more success with Jeff, but there are plenty of players in the top 10 with that specific build and that specific change. As far as how this deck plays, you are very straightforwardly attempting to fulfill the requirements that your cards need to be broken. And what I mean by that is you want to play 2 cards a turn to make your Thena large. You want to play out your Mysterio in order to make your Mockingbird cheap and your Sasquatch cheap. Sometimes these run up against each other. You kind of just have to deal with it. It is important to plan those turns out so you have only one turn of not playing 2 cards for your Thena. But generally speaking, it's pretty straightforward. You put your cards in your Angela lane that can move out of the Angela lane. You play 2 cards a turn for your Thena. You make your Mockingbird very cheap. You make your Sasquatch very cheap. You make your Iron Man very cheap. And you put a bunch of points on the board. Next up for me in terms of importance is, of course, Zoo. Now, this deck has fallen off just a bit, in part due to the previous deck that we talked about, so we are including Shadow King, which in my view is necessary to make that matchup plausible. This deck is very good at putting points on the board, but it's not necessarily very good at beating Angela's unless you have the Shadow King, which does add a real ability to combat what I would consider the dominant deck that is doing points and competing in the same niche as Zoo, the Ravonna deck that we just talked about. Now, that said, I do think that the Ravonna deck and the Zoo deck occupy the same niche, which is we're going to put a lot of points on the board, we're going to be a Mockingbird deck, and generally we're just going to have large numbers. I do think the Ravonna deck, when it draws well, is a little better at that, which puts Zoo's status as a legitimate contender into question. That said, it is absolutely still a perfectly fine choice for anyone who is looking to pick a deck that they're just comfortable with. And one thing that I do want to warn you about, though, is that this deck, more than a lot of other decks in Marvel Snap, feels like it has 2 halves. You have your top end, which is Blue Marvel, Gilgamesh, and that's very on rails. And so if you don't have a good early game and you're stuck with all this top end stuff in hand, you end up really falling apart because your top end is dependent on your early game. It reminds me a lot, actually, of how the Blink Leech decks played out, where your bad hands sort of compounded themselves because your top end was dependent on your early game. You were unable to, like, really make comebacks into the game unless you were really lucky. Now, in service of that, I think Shauna might be the most important card in this list because it is such a board filler. Yes, she will throw some of the time. That absolutely will happen, but you are going to be able to get a ton of bodies on the board, which is what your whole deck is predicated on. There is not a single card that creates more bodies than Shauna. And I think that makes her very crucial for how this deck plays out. As far as, like, specific tech cards, I have a Nocturne in there, a Chimera in there, and those are my major tech slots alongside Shadow King. You can do whatever you want. I've seen someone running an extra 1-drop. I've seen people running a different tech card, like a Rogue instead of a Nocturne. That extra 1-drop has been Snow Guard sometimes, so you have something to do with Limbo decks. It's a pretty flexible shell, and those 3 spots are really what you want to play around with. I do think right now Chimera ends up pretty important because of the amount of decks that just incidentally run Killmonger, but if you're not running into that, you can feel free to replace Chimera with another 1-drop. Now, you know it wouldn't be a KMBest video if I didn't talk about Loki. I have enjoyed playing Loki into the Ravonna deck and into Zoo. I think it's fairly well positioned, but not overwhelmingly so. I think those decks, in addition, if Loki ends up being something they want to try to beat, they can include cards like Mobius because of the way they're able to include tech cards. I do think that right now Loki has a relatively favored matchup. I'm very much in favor of doing the Blink stuff as well. I don't think I have a better Loki build than just doing what I'm doing with the Blink to double down on the Loki. However, I am no longer as sure as when everything was Zoo. One thing I am positive about is that Loki is great into Zoo. I am less positive that it is that good into the Ravonna stuff. That's a bit of a different thing. That turn 5 Loki is a little bit worse in that matchup than it is against Zoo. That turn 5 Loki against Zoo, it's great. You can do whatever you want anyway. At turn 5 Loki against Ravonna, you have a lot of sort of conditional, awkward things, and that does reduce the efficacy of the Blink plan a little bit. I have noticed this personally, where it's just like, oh, I'm just running into some huge issues when I'm Lokiing into that deck and I don't have a Quinjet and I'm like not proccing my Thena, and they are very able to compete with you on points, much like the old Professor decks in that same shell were able to, because while I do think Loki on 4 specifically is very good, Loki on 5 definitely runs the risk of like Athena and an Angela just outscaling what you can deal with. And so I do think that I'm willing to talk about like changing this, getting Blink out of here, seeing what we can do about that matchup. I'd be interested to see what it is. As of right now, I still think this is the best positioned deck into the metagame as a whole in terms of how we're going to build Loki, but I am a little less confident in that due to the rise in the Ravonna deck. Silver Surfer is a deck that is generally pretty well positioned right now. It has a bunch of stuff going for it. Basically, there are sort of 3 matchups that I think about when I think about why this deck is well positioned. Matchup number 1 is Zoo, and of course this is a Killmonger deck, so obviously you have some potential for a real blowout in that matchup. Matchup number 2 is Loki, and as a deck that can run Mobius but doesn't always necessarily have to, you can choose to beat that matchup if you wish. What you'll notice about this build is it's a little aggressive. I don't have the Mobius in there because I'm working on a theory that Surfer, when it gets Loki'd, isn't all that upset. For the same reason that many decks that have a lot of early scalers aren't super upset when they get Loki, because they use their cards better than the Loki does. You have spent the game setting up Surfer and setting up Surfer targets. You have your Sebastian Shaw out there. You have your Brute Absman out there, right? They have to sort of scrape by and figure it out. And that can be done, but it's not as easy as, say, when you're Lokiing into Zoo. So I think this deck, not only with the ability to run Mobius, you can do that, but also generally, I'm less afraid of getting Loki'd in Surfer than I am with many other decks in a similar shape. Now, of course, the final matchup I think of is Sandman, which sort of grew out of the Makari release, and Surfer is very good into Sandman if you can play Brute Abs. Sandman's whole deal is, I would like to be ahead. You can prevent them from being ahead by playing Brood and Absorbing Man. So when I think about a lot of the common matchups, Surfer, despite not being my favorite deck ever, the best thing I'd ever want to do, does seem fairly well positioned. I also want to shout out Yo Woody, who is ride or die for cutting Shaw in order to fit in a rogue in Surfer. One thing that he is a big fan of is making sure that you get rogue in the deck, and Shaw, a little bit worse than Gladiator, generally speaking. Can be better. very often worse. In terms of how this deck plays out, your Absorbing Man really does two things. With Hope Summers, he can be a second Silver Surfer. Without Hope Summers, he is very often just second Brood. Both of these are valid approaches, but don't sit there thinking, oh, well, you know, I'm gonna not Brood this Silver Surfer. Most of the time, you should make sure that you are absorbing the Brood. So, this is Sandman. It's actually the Makari deck that I put together on day one based on a shell from Rain Man, and I am fairly confident that it is the best version of that shell. I've seen a lot of people trying a lot of different stuff in it. However, I think that this is just a straightforward, powerful, and good deck that is looking to play a very simple, obvious game plan. It asks one question: are you behind me? And if you are winning the game, you can leader and make sure it happens the way you want. Your backup plan for setting up leader is having a bunch of cards that move. This can allow you to set up leader even if you're not Sandmanning, and of course, generally, you're kind of just playing a lot of good cards in this deck where you are able to play a coherent mid-range game plan, even though it's a little bit lower powered than some of the stuff other decks are doing. Cough, cough, Ravonna. So generally, this deck looks to be pretty straightforward, which means it's a little bit abusable by good players. One thing I really want to point out is if you think your opponent might be playing this deck and you're playing like a Athena deck, one thing I would look to avoid doing is playing out Jeff early. I look for basically any excuse to save Jeff for the Sandman turn when I am able to do that. Because that is not just a Athena proc, that is an unexpected outcome. And leveraging that is very powerful in the face of someone when playing Sandman who is very confident that you are only going to be playing one card. By the same token, in this deck, sometimes your final turn through a Sandman is Miss Marvel or Captain Marvel and a Jeff. It'll be like that sometimes. It really, really will. You don't have to tunnel vision on the big guys in order to make this deck work. So Magic is a bit of a tough subject for me because it's my opinion that a lot of Magic decks are either this sort of dock and pray or just like kind of obnoxious combos, but it is an undeniably powerful card. When I look at a deck like this, I think a lot of people look at it and they see, oh, it's a mill deck. What this deck actually is a Magic and Doc Ock deck. The mill stuff is like, it's cool, it's not your win condition. You are attempting to win the game by disrupting your opponent with Dr. Octopus and having an extra turn to make up for the damage that he may have done to you. Dr. Octopus is a very powerful disruptive tool, and this deck leverages that to the fullest by using Magic to get that extra turn, making sure that this is the deck for all of the sickos who want deterministic wins. There is a large contingent of players in Marvel Snap who really just want a guaranteed win when they queue up. This deck is the best in the game at creating guaranteed wins. Now, you might say, oh, that's a really good thing. It's not a great thing because the guaranteed wins are very obvious to your opponent too. You are very rarely getting a lot of cubes in a game with this deck unless your opponent messes up. In addition, as a Magic-reliant deck, you end up being vulnerable to things like Snow Guard and Nocturne. It becomes very important too if your opponent is playing Nocturne. Try to wait and see if you can Magic the Nocturne lane, or alternatively, Doc Ock the Magic lane and see if they're not smart enough to move the Nocturne to that Magic lane, getting rid of Limbo in the first place. These are the kind of tips and tricks you're going to need if you want to take a deck like this with the cube equity it has and actually succeed with it. It's pretty good, but being as telegraphed as it is not necessarily a strength. It is also a weakness. This is the generic mid-range shell, of course, Annihilus Sersi package. What I found when playing it is it just felt a little bit inferior to the Ravonna version of this. They're doing similar things, disruptive, points, Mockingbird stuff, but the Ravonna version of this gets to play Iron Man, and this deck doesn't, and the Ravonna version of this gets to play Angela and Kitty and Athena, and this deck doesn't. And so they end up having similar end games with just like a legitimately worse early game in the case of this deck. Now, there are some cool things you can do. I've seen a version, and I put this on the last tier list, but I figured it would just be worth talking about here, where you run Juggernaut and Cosmo in here to like really try to get people. But the thing is, I feel like the other deck could do that too if you really wanted to. And I'm struggling to find a reason to play this deck right now because I don't know if people are aware of this. Annihilus never sends over the Sentry anymore. It just doesn't happen. There's too many people playing Nocturne and Jeff and Kitty and ways to fill up that right lane. It just actually straight up doesn't happen. He does not do that anymore. And because of that, you end up in these situations where it's like, I really want to, but it's never going to happen. So I guess I Sersi it or something. And generally, you just end up, when you're doing that, in a worse scenario than the person who is, playing a cheap Sasquatch, playing a cheap Mockingbird, playing a cheap Sage, playing a cheap Iron Man, doing a bunch of unfair stuff in a similar way. When you're competing with that person on points and you aren't really disrupting their board, you end up in a losing position. And I think that's a bit of an awkward spot for this deck, in my opinion. Gnome's build of no mid-range is my preferred Sersi death build for this iteration of the tier list. And this is a sort of tried and true archetype, but it is a bit of a new twist on it, where what's happening here is just sort of very clearly what we're trying to do is just the biggest possible numbers to the exclusion of actually even running Sersi. Like, this deck looked at the previous deck and was like, you know what sucks? Sersi, Annihilus, Sentry, let's get rid of them. We're not doing that anymore. It looked at the previous metagame and was like, oh, you know what? I'm never actually Annihilusing anything, and the Sersi stuff just isn't enough points. So what if we got rid of all of that? So that's why we're calling it no mid-range. Like, this isn't a Sersi Annihilus deck, but it is a direct descendant of them. And what it's saying is that stuff doesn't cut it right now, because of what we just talked about. What this deck is trying to do is cut out all the fat. If you play this against the previous deck, you are going to be in this very dominant position where you just have more points than them because they're doing Annihilus stuff and you literally just don't care because you have so many giant dudes. Now, that's what this deck is really trying to accomplish. A cheap Scar, a cheap Death, a cheap Sasquatch, a cheap Mockingbird. Yes, you heinously lose to the card Mobius M. Mobius. More than any other deck, actually. Like, you get very rolled. Hence, we have a Rogue in here that can maybe help you out some of the time. Rogue also just has, like, a lot of general utility, though, with people playing Blue Marvel, with people playing things like Iron Man, especially. In that Ravonna deck, being able to Rogue an Iron Man is a really big deal when you have as many big bodies as this deck does. I think it's very clear what this deck is attempting to do. What I don't know is how it matches up into that Ravonna deck, especially, because that, I think, is going to be the make or break for this list. Namora is still pretty good, honestly. I am generally a fan of this deck. It's a little bit, on rails. It's a little bit straightforward, but I think there's a little bit less Red Guardian running around than there was in the previous metagame. And now you're in a situation where, like, there's a lot of decently early snaps. A Wong is a great punish to early snaps because someone snaps into you, they think, oh, you're not doing very much. You have a Wong lane. It is just absolutely disgusting. And I think one of the key things to understand about this deck is you have a dangerous turn 6 with a very powerful mix-up. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a Wong and a White Tiger, right? They think, okay, they're going to play an Odin. I'm going to win the Wong lane. You get to dominate that Wong lane with a Sage. And that is sort of a very difficult thing to play around. Having the potential to have this, like, arbitrarily large Sage. When you Sage on a Wong, she's usually just like 20. She's just like 20 on turn 6. And that's just like a really difficult thing for your opponents to deal with, having to figure out what's actually happening on this turn 6. How do I want to manage this? Because they can either put 28 power in the other two lanes or like 20 power in this lane, and I have to figure out which one it is. Of course, there are some other things to talk about here. Obviously, getting your Namora, hitting things that move is sort of a very crucial thing that's happening here. In addition, you are also a Ravonna deck, although it's like a little bit less useful here than it is in the variety of ridiculous things that it's doing in the other lists. And I think generally just being a Wong deck gives you this combo ability into a bunch of stuff that is very, very powerful. Blost Rider has been running around recently. I personally think it's a little bit inferior to the typical Sandman build because it introduces RNG in exchange for a chance at greater power. If that's something you're interested in doing, I think that's very, very fine. But the reason you play the Sandman build right now, in my opinion, is because it is consistent. It has a game plan going into every game. You know what you're going to get out of it, and what you get out of it is usually fairly reasonable. This deck adds a lot of question marks into that. And those question marks can be good. Those question marks can turn into exclamation points, but they can also turn into like little sad emojis, right? It's not always better to aim for higher power in exchange for, convenience or for consistency. Now, it can be, but to me, I prefer the other builds of Sandman. It's not that these are not valid or good. They're both of those things. They're just not what I want to be doing in the archetype right now. However, you can really pop off with a deck like this. Speaking of pop-offs, Electro Blink with the addition of Sersi now has 2 blinks to get rid of that Electro, which is a pretty reasonably strong thing to do. One thing that is a little bit funny about this deck is like it's sort of premised on getting rid of the Electro, right? You blink the Electro, you Sersi the Electro, we're turning that downside into an upside, but it's not really built to take advantage of that. Like it's not really built to be like, oh, I'm going to use this extra energy to do anything. It's really just I'm going to use this extra energy to do the same thing I was already doing. Like I'm still going to do this, play 1 card on turn 5, play 1 card on turn 6 thing most of the time. And so you end up in like a bit of a weird spot. It does enable you to like get Jeffs out there more reasonably some of the time, but it is like a little, you're looking at it like, oh, okay, I'm not really sure, but yeah, sure. This deck does points very well. It's a very straightforward type of Sandman deck. It is a strong and reasonable thing to choose if you are looking to restrict what your opponent is trying to do, and if you are looking for a deck with a like genuinely shockingly powerful nut draw. When you have this ability to do, Electro into Blink, it's a powerful thing. But it did need a backup Blink in the form of Sersi before it started getting really consistent. And now I think that it is fair to say this is an actual deck. You can play it. You will be able to do things. There are strong things that you can accomplish in this shell, thanks to the power of turning Electro into something that's actually relevant on the board. I'm as shocked as anyone, but Sera is around, and I think this is mostly a reaction to Zoo as a sort of concept, right? People were like, all right, it's time to beat up on Zoo, Invisible Woman Killmonger, let's get him. But I've been in situations against this deck where it's just like, oh, I kind of can't beat Shang-Chi, Shadow King in some points, right? Like, there's a lot of decks out there, especially the Ravonna deck, where I wouldn't be shocked if the matchup into Sera was actually quite awkward, or at least required a decent amount of managing. When you have that Ravonna deck, there's usually a very clear target for an Iron Man with that Red Guardian. There's a lot of options for hitting things with Shang-Chi between Thena and Angela and Sasquatch. You can Invisible Woman your Killmonger or your tech cards for that lane. There's a lot of powerful stuff that this deck can accomplish in a lot of different sort of point-focused matchups. I am fairly convinced that there is some build out there of this deck that makes sense. It runs into issues against things like the Sandman deck, which are just playing better cards, and then their 5-drop kind of annihilates your 5-drop. I'm not totally confident with this deck into Silver Surfer, which is, again, kind of doing a similar thing, but their points are just more than yours, and your interaction isn't very good against them. So it's an awkward deck, I think. Like, there are very good matchups, and there are very not good matchups, and you kind of just have to live with that. Speaking of things you kind of just have to live with, Hela is okay, question mark? I don't see it a lot, and when I do, it's like fairly threatening, but not necessarily the most threatening. And then you have these like new Ravonna decks that Iron Man can actually just win them the game against you very reasonably. Hela's in a bit of an awkward spot because one of the things I talked about when it first got nerfed was, are there going to be point decks that can actually just beat it? Just straight up beat it on points? And the answer does seem to be yeah, like that Ravonna deck, when it draws about as well as you would expect it to draw, can absolutely just beat Hela on points now. And a lot of it is just like, did I discard the Infinite? Because if you didn't, you're gonna probably lose to that deck just on the numbers that it's outputting with a reasonable draw. Not all their draws are reasonable, but not all your draws are reasonable either, especially now that we're a Corvus Glaive deck again, because we are so focused on actually getting our discards to go the way that we want them. To me, the appeal of Hela was always that it was untouchable. It was going to be bigger than any of the like other kind of point decks that could reasonably combat it. And it is no longer untouchable, thanks in a large part to the power of Iron Man in that Ravonna shell. I got mollywopped by Phoenix Force. I'm not overly convinced that it's like amazing or anything, but it's a pretty good deck and you can absolutely play it. It is, in my opinion, not particularly consistent, but I guess that's not really my opinion. It is not particularly consistent, but when it pops off, it's very good. You can do a lot of interesting surprise plays with it. You have a lot more final turn equity than I think people think, and those close games can be won with the tricky application of just some general tips and tricks about Phoenix Force. Now, I do think that a lot of people are going to look at this deck and be like, well, all I need to do is do the combo. I just need to do the combo. I will tell you, I lost so much to Shuri Nimrod that like I'm like legitimately just going to look at you like, look, some of the points decks can beat that, but it's a lot of them just actually can't. A lot of them just actually can't beat Shuri Nimrod into Baboom Baboom. Or at the very least, you end up creating these 50-50s on which lane is the Venom lane and which lane is the lane that is not getting the stuff in it. And I think like those sort of awkward situations where your opponent has to read you are very reasonable in terms of like end game outcomes from your backup plan, where you're able to put good decks in I have to read scenarios on your backup plan where you don't do anything for like 4 turns. That's powerful. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it to the end of that video. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed any decks. Please do let me know, because I'm recording this at the end of a 10.5-hour stream. I think it is entirely possible. That said, I hope this helped you get a handle on the meta and the sort of things I would expect to see, and then the sort of sub-tier just a little below that, where it's like, these are good decks, you can absolutely play them, but I don't think they make it to the top of the heap. As always, I have been KMBest, you have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.